Good afternoon, Professor Corrales. Welcome to this session. Thank you for accepting the invitation to ask you some questions on the subject of sustainability. This interview that I am doing with you is part of the material that students of the subject, Research and Sustainability at the Metropolitan University, must handle. Professor Corrales is Venezuelan. He is a specialist in international development issues, the economy of globalization. He is a mechanical engineer from the Central University of Venezuela. He has a diploma in public policies from the Inter-American Center for Public Administration of the OAS in Washington. He has a master's degree in development planning from the CENTDE of the UCB. He directs the NGO Responses to Development and is also part of the Orinoco Group organization. He is a member of the National Academy of Engineering and Habitat. Thank you very much for attending this interview, and the purpose of asking you these questions is to facilitate the knowledge of the students of this subject. So, well, without further ado, without further details, I will begin to ask you the questions related to the subject of sustainable development. Well, to begin, the first question is very simple. What are the fundamental concepts of the sustainable human development approach? Thank you very much, Maria Antonietta, for the sustainable human development approach. It is a relatively new approach, about the last 30 years or so. I would say it is one of the last stages of evolution of the concepts of development that began to be articulated immediately after the Second World War, worldwide, and that were born fundamentally in Latin America. The fundamental concepts of this approach have to do on the one hand with the human person, on the other hand with the way in which he manages to create capacities and use them to achieve goals, to realize himself, and they have to do with institutions. Those are the great changes. Then I enter the field of the human person. The concept of full freedom, the concept of realization. Realization consists of being able to live the life that a person has reasons to value, and for that he needs to have been endowed with human capacities, and that there is no exogenous factor that prevents him from using them to realize himself. That is to say, as I said before, for the life that he has reasons to value. That is connected with the perception of Amartya Sen. What then do human capacities consist of according to Amartya Sen? The capacities are seen by Amartya Sen. They are also seen by Martha Nousby, who is a North American sociologist and political scientist who has worked a lot on the topics of human development. Sees them as the potentialities of a person to transform opportunities into life achievements. That is, those achievements that make him live the life he has reason to value. The Marches sees them as potentialities that can only be built. That is, the human can only build those potentialities if he enjoys the freedoms to live in relationship with others, to access capital resources. You must have heard of human capital, natural capital, relational social capital, which fundamentally refers to cooperation between peers in a society, and political capital, which refers to the power to influence the decisions that are made. Society, very interesting if it is basically about those freedoms. Then I am going to another question. If the questions are linked to what you are saying, then how is it developed? How are sustainable human development, freedom and individual fulfillment related, and what are the areas of the sustainable development processes for you? Look first that nothing In the approach of sustainable human development, the subject is the human person. And the object, that is, the purpose of human development. Sustainable is also the human person. The person is realized to the extent that he is effectively free. That is, to the extent, as I said before, that he has human capacities and can apply them without there being exogenous forces that prevent him from realizing himself. That is, to build and live the life that that person has reasons to value. That is the first, let's say, the first link. And an age develops. That is, the development process is associated with society as the process of realization. The human person is associated. A society develops when all its members, that is, people, are expanding their freedoms. That is why the approach of sustainable human development is often called the approach of development as freedom. And what are those 5 freedoms? That defines SEN to develop human capacities, I told you before. You have to have freedoms to access sources of resources. That is, what is the main source of resources to create human capacity? Is what is usually called human capital. The fundamental ways are quality education and health care, and in an organized society. Fundamentally also having social security. That is a first freedom, is that through all its activities, and fundamentally the activities of production, when the person gets involved in work, enjoy that access. All young people and children must have access to quality education. If they are not capable of developing capacities, a second freedom. The freedom to undertake to live through the relationship at work. To live the life that has reasons to, the life that has reasons to value. And a third freedom is the freedom to cooperate with others, with peers in society, and to create capacities for the whole society. There are human capacities, that is, those of each person. And there are systemic capacities of society. And those are only built when there is cooperation among members of society, and when there is freedom to undertake. The state that must administer the system of rights. The system by which the rights of people are protected must not assume functions that correspond to it. Assume each of the individual members of society. One of the rights that the state must protect is the right to human entrepreneurship. I don't know if this is free and is fundamental at this moment in Venezuela, and it is very clear. The relationship between sustainable development and freedom and development of capacities and capacity for agency is very clear. Professor Corrales, when a society follows an ideal course of sustainable development to obtain the achievements of development? Look, it is a web of thought that is not going to be easy for me to repeat in the same way as it is written, for example, in the documents that we have shared, but I am going to try, in an ideal course of development, all the conditions that we have talked about are given. The first is, the members of society are free to create capacities and to use them for their own development. They cooperate with other members of society and create systemic capacities, that is, they create, for example, capacities of the economy so that progress is made for the whole of society. They create capacities, for example, of health systems and education systems so that many members of society benefit from quality education and health opportunities in an economy that works because these capacities have been created. There is sustained growth. If there were any exogenous impact, on the process of economic growth that diverts the economy from its course. In an ideal process, society would very quickly returns to its course that it had lost for a moment. If it does not, it can get into serious problems that we could talk about, and you will probably ask me a question in relation to that. Surely yes, later on. Process in which there is economic progress. All members of society have opportunities to progress individually as families. There is a progressive decrease in poverty in society if it had started from a level in which there were relatively high levels of poverty. The institutions, I was going precisely to that question, Professor. What importance? Institutions have two large functions, two families of functions. The first is to guarantee the rights of all members of society. When in a society there are values valued in common. For example, when private property is appreciated. When access to quality education is appreciated for all, that society through institutions protects them with rights. That is, rights are protections that the institutional system of a society gives to those values that society shares. The right to property, the right to family security, etc. But the second group of functions that institutions have is to keep the economy running. What I described earlier as the ideal development process. Keeping it running, I'll give you an example. Keeping the economy running without experiencing an external shock implies, for example, that there is economic freedom, but also that it is protected. That the economy is protected from what is usually called an external shock. In the Venezuelan case, we have experienced very serious external shocks when the prices of oil exports fall. And why does it not hurt us so much? A fall in the price of oil exports, because practically the only thing we export is oil, and one way in which institutions can protect society from the effect of an external shock of this type, there are two ways basically. One is a way that is maintained in the long term, and that is to diversify exports. That is the role of public policies that are part of exports. But another way in which institutions can protect Venezuela from the impacts of these price shocks of international oil prices is the creation and effective operation of a stabilization fund. When oil prices fall from the stabilization fund, resources must come out so that the functioning of society does not stop, so that, for example, the education and health systems continue to function at good levels. Every time we have experienced an external price shock, the first thing that is damaged in Venezuela are the public health systems and the education systems. Education, I don't know if it was very clear. And it is very evident and very clear that sustainable human development has to do with a systemic connection of all aspects of a country. Starting from the human being and the development of his capacities in freedom. And I ask you this following question. Why are the imaginaries important for the sustainable development of a country? Well, I'm going to the imaginaries. First of all are the sets of valuations and beliefs that social groups share in an entire society. One of the components of the imaginaries that is very important for social cohesion, for the cohesion of a society, is what is usually called the original myths of society. We Venezuelans have some myths that well. American independence practically arose from Venezuela. The compatriots who are military share in their imaginaries. It is a myth. Necessarily lie. Let's be clear, a myth is a value that is assigned to the origin of a certain quality of society. The myth of independence. The myth that the independence of America depended on American independence, which in turn depended on the Venezuelan military, who in reality were not military. They were Venezuelan horse, llaneros. Almost all of them led by a few Creoles who pursued the freedom of society. But it is around that a whole myth was built, that is to say, a whole imagining of beliefs that constitute the imaginary. But it belongs to the imaginary, also. For example, the attachment to freedom. There are societies, the societies in the late 80s. The societies of East Germany, of Poland, of Hungary. Of all the countries that were under the socialist aegis. Those societies really had 70 years in this. Some of them, Russia was 70 years old. But East Germany was 50 years old, those societies. Because their educational systems had ideologized society in a certain way. They had lost the attachment to freedom, individual freedom. How interesting, however, barely. Because the imaginaries are maintained and transmitted from generation to generation. However, barely. There was the spark that occurred. Precisely in East Germany. The spark sank throughout Eastern Europe they became reality again. And decisions to fight for individual freedom. Yes, how interesting they imagined. You will realize how important it is for a society. For example, that there is social cohesion. That we Venezuelans are united and not in permanent confrontation. It is very important for us to come to an agreement, to cooperate. One of the capacities, or one of the sources of capacities, is relational social capital. That is, cooperation. If Venezuelans are disunited, if we do not share a future vision of the country, we are not able to cooperate, we are not able to make efforts in the same direction. Then that explains, and that leads me to ask you this: what is the role of the actors? What are those roles for the achievement of the development objectives of a country, and in our case in Venezuela? What are those roles and the value of those roles, of the roles? Well, actually you can identify a multiplicity of roles, but I am going to try to summarize. The role of each one of the citizens cannot be separated. Separated from the role that the leaders have, the leaders in any activity. For example, in the educational sector, the role of a teacher is a role. It is a role in which the responsibility is enormous to make it accessible to the child or the young person. Knowledge, to make that knowledge not be static, not be in any case digested, because it is imparted by the teacher or the professor. But that it is the result of that knowledge being the result of an interaction in which the student is putting into practice the capacities that he has created, then that is a very specific role, that of the teacher, but in general there are in the social area. Among which are the roles of teachers, for example, roles of education leaders who have to be permanently contributing to renewing the orientation of education. But in the political field there are the roles of political leaders. And here I am going to try to unite with the imaginaries, because there is something very important. The greatest danger that democracy has had since it exists, since the time of the Greeks. That greatest danger occurs from the 1930s of the 20th century. In the figure of a political leader who is the populist leader. The populist leader, instead of contributing to there being unity in a society, to there being cohesion, the populist leader. The populist leader imagines society divided between the good guys, who are the figures he exalts among the people, and an elite that is always corrupt and betrays the interests of the people. He builds an imaginary end. They build the imaginary in order to convince society that there is conflict in all societies, but in societies, when there is conflict, there must be a leader, especially a charismatic leader. A leader who has popular support, so that's what the populist leader does. It is instead of promoting cohesion, promoting polarization, it promotes confrontation. To those who feel to those who feel like the excluded people, the people who have not had opportunities, he insists that it is that elite which has seized all the wealth that could have corresponded to him. To the man of the home popular to promote confrontation does what has happened to us in the last 25 years in Venezuela. It makes society, instead of uniting, develop unshared imaginaries. Does not share a vision of the future that is one of the fundamental components of the imaginary. It divides and confronts each other, that in the role. Returning to the subject of roles, in the role of the politician, it unites them. A fundamental subject for which every citizen has to be prepared is to claim from politician who promotes great betrayal of that promotion of polarization. Is that finally the populist political leader? What he does is that taking advantage of the support of those people to whom he has fed a series of ideas of confrontation. Taking advantage of that support, the populist leader captures the institutions, and that happened to us Venezuelans 25 years ago. The institutions were progressively captured. And it has been very difficult for us to overcome this, but that was not invented in Venezuela. The first very successful populist leaders in the world were Adolfo Hitler and Benito Mussolini in Italy, who basically did the same thing. They made their societies confront each other and captured the institutions, and then they tried to do it worldwide. In Latin America in the last years of the decade of the 1940s, Peronism developed, which is one of the great examples of populism. In short, in the fundamental roles are those of a political leader who promotes cohesion, unity and progress, who promotes freedom, and there is the role of the populist politician who does absolutely the opposite. Contrary. A very important role is the role that all of us can play in production and in production. That is, in the functioning of the economy, I mean. And in the functioning of the economy there are very important roles, both for the worker and for the entrepreneur or for the businessman. Manager of a company or manager of the private business sector of the economy, and there are roles in the area or in the cultural sphere. I already mentioned that of the teacher, but that of the researcher, that of the university professor, the roles. In each one of the areas you can find roles that all citizens must assume, and leadership roles in one of the fundamental leadership areas. For example, in Venezuela is the area of research and innovation. In general, about entrepreneurship, about the modernization of Venezuelan society so that it is capable of once again assuming a path that we unfortunately lost many years ago. A path of sustainable development. Well, the best thing is your contributions, they are wonderful and above all, the closing that you give, giving importance to the role of research and of the educator as a researcher, which is the object of this subject. I want to thank you, Professor, but I would like to extend the invitation to a new interview to continue addressing a series of questions and to delve deeper into the issues of sustainable development. It is clear that the issue of sustainable development has to do with all areas of development of a country, and it was very clear with your presentation. Thank you very much, Professor, and we count on you for the next interview. Thank you very much, Maria Antonietta.